Hi, this is Mr. Fernandez. I'm here on my porch on a beautiful day to talk about one of my favorite things, history and writing history. I want to provide you with a quick model for responding to, model response rather, to the DBQ that you guys worked on, the practice DBQ from period 4 or unit 3 about the transportation revolution. This is the DBQ you guys did. The question was, evaluate the extent to which transportation innovation contributed to American national unity in the period from 1800 to 1860. I'm going to, and so what I went ahead and did was I took a few minutes to write a response. This isn't a beautiful, perfect response. It's not 100% polished, and that's kind of the point. Is I wrote it quickly so that it more or less mimics something that you might write on the AP exam. What I'm going to do is walk you through each part of this so you can compare it to what you did and see where you might have room for improvement for yours and where you hit the target on your practice DBQ. I'm going to use the rubric that I've been using with my classes this year. Sorry, I'm going back and forth between different documents here. And that's this document, this rubric here. The this rubric is not exactly the rubric that the AP exam will be scored on, but like I've said all year, what this rubric represents our effort to make the AP or the College Board's rubric intelligible to students and to make it fit with the claim evidence reasoning paradigm that City Schools of Decatur students are um, use over the course of several years. So it's not to reinvent the wheel or make you kind of reinvent the wheel. That's the idea here, is that we're making it fit into that paradigm, the AP rubric. So you might want to have this handy as I go through the essay. Another thing I'm going to use is this template here for cause effect and effect prompt. This is an ideal way of structuring your essay that I've been using in my classes all year. And this specifically is for a DBQ that asks you about cause or effect of something. Okay, so let's get to it. So again, the question is, evaluate the extent to which transportation innovation contributed to American national unity. So in other words, what was the effect of the transportation revolution of the first half of the 19th century to create national unity or not? That's basically the question they're asking you to consider. Um, let's start with the thesis. So um, what I tell my students is that a thesis, a good thesis, might take one of two different approaches. Uh-oh, wait. So I'm going to also use this template. Um, this template is what I've suggested to my students is a good way of organizing um, either a long essay question or a DBQ. This happens to be for a DBQ because it contains language about document analysis. But if you take all that stuff out and keep the rest, LEQs are basically the same thing as DBQs in terms of structure. And what I tell my students is that there's really two options for a thesis paragraph. Now, this is for a cause or effect question that is more open-ended. So most cause or effect questions are something like evaluate the effects of the Cold War, making you have to basically decide what the major effects were and what some less less important secondary minor effects might have been. And so that's how this is laid out. This question that you have is, I think, a lot more easy to respond, if you can want to use that term, because they're basically giving you a yes or no question. Did transportation contribute to national unity? Yes or no, or yes and no, making it a bit easier. So what I did was I chose option A. I'm going to suggest that it was primarily um, no is the answer, and I'm going to use this template. Oops, this template to answer that question. So let's have a look at how I did that. So anyway, to begin with, notice how I start with contextualization. That's the first part of my thesis. Remember, that's one of the things they want you to do. In their words, they want you to, let's see if I can find that part here, describe the broader historical context relevant to the prompt. In the language that we use on, oops, sorry, on our rubrics, too many screens here, or windows. In our rubric is that at the beginning of your thesis, of your opening paragraph, you should situate the argument by adequately describing the broader historical context. So, meaning talk about something that was happening immediately before, during the same exact time period, or immediately after this time period, um, and make sure that you provide some specific details, not just kind of very vague, big generalities, and explain how those developments, those events that you talk about, stop it, relate to the topic of the prompt. Let me show you what I mean by that by walking you through my example. So the prompt is about, going back here, the prompt is about the transportation revolution or innovations in transportation during the period between 1800 to 1860. So I could have talked about a lot of things that happened before 1800, like the American Revolution, the drafting of the Constitution, the political divisions between the early Federalists and the Democratic Republicans in the 1790s, you name it. That would have been fair game because it happened before 1800. I could have talked about things that happened immediately after 1860. The Civil War, of course, comes to mind as the first thing that comes to mind, and or Reconstruction. Instead, what I chose to write about was something that was happening at the same time, between 1800 and 1860. But doing so, choosing something that happened in the same time period, means that it has to be something that is not directly related to the transportation revolution, because that's the topic of my essay. And what they want me to talk about is in that first section of the thesis, which is a place that I'm suggesting you put it in, what they treat as, quote, the broader historical context. They want you to talk about something that is beyond the transportation revolution, that puts the transportation revolution into context. And at the same time, they don't say that here, but they mean it, and I know this because I've graded these essays for them and I've gone through all their trainings. They want you to explain why you're talking about that history. How does that thing you're talking about relate to the topic of the prompt, which is the transportation revolution? So, back to my model. I said, and I'm going to highlight my contextualization. I write, in the first half of the 19th century, the United States saw a flurry of reform-oriented activity in publications, speeches, and other forms of activism. Women's rights activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, education reformers like Horace Mann, members of such temperance organizations as the Washingtonians, and many others worked tirelessly to address what they perceived as the country's shortcomings and sins. Much of this activism, often controversial and divisive, was inspired by radical changes taking place in the U.S. economic and social systems, most notably the market and transportation revolutions of the early 1800s. So, having chosen to talk about something that happened during the time period in question, between 1800 and 1860, I have therefore chosen to talk about something that is not the transportation revolution, because that's the topic of the essay. I'm providing the broader context here. I'm talking instead about something that was happening at the same time, the reform movements that we've learned about, the abolitionism, women's rights activism, asylum and prison reform, education reform, etc. So I talk about that. I use some specific details, like talking about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Horace Mann, and I explained how that relates to the topic, because I can't just kind of throw something out there and just move on. I have to connect it in some way to the transportation revolution, and that's I do, and it doesn't take much to do that, but that's what I do here. Much of this activism was inspired by radical changes taking place in the US economic and social systems, because it's true, it was. All the many ways that the transportation revolution and uh, the market revolution that we've talked about, the industrialization that came with that, really led to a great deal of economic and social transformations that made people want to make America even better. And so these changes were inspired, rather, these reforms were inspired by these radical changes. And so that's where I connected to the transportation revolutions. Having done that, I get my point for boom right here for contextualization. And now I move on to the meat of my thesis, which is where I lay out my argument. Remember, the question is evaluate the extent to which transportation revolution or innovations forged American national unity between 1800 and 1860. I strongly suggest that you write a thesis that looks something like this. We started with contextualization. And then, since this is a yes or no question, this or that question, I'm going to start with the that, meaning the counterclaim, as we've referred to it all year. I'm going to suggest that, whatchamacallit, I'm going to suggest that there are those who might argue that the transportation revolution created national unity, and I'm going to even talk a little bit about what evidence they might use to describe or to prove that the transportation revolution forged national unity. And then I'm going to argue that they're wrong, and rather that the transportation revolution led to national disunity. So let's move on to the counterclaim part. And let me highlight that part here. Some might argue that the transportation revolution helped to forge national unity by, for instance, forging deeper economic ties between the North and the South. That's my counterclaim. Notice how I don't stop here. This is where what a lot of people do, is they just say, well, the opposite of what I'm going to say might be true. But they're not likely to give you credit for this. They want you to explore in a more meaty way the counterclaim or the complexity of the topic. You can't just say, well, some people might say that it did forge national unity, but they're wrong. You don't really explore the counterclaim. You don't really explore the argument. You have to look at least one category that somebody might use to defend the claim that the transportation revolution helped to forge national unity. And that category that I use is the notion that it may have forged deeper economic ties between the North and the South. Now, I can't just stop at that either, because it's really important for you to give at least cursorily examine the evidence or some evidence that someone advocating for the counterclaim might use. That's really what they mean by exploring the controversy or the complexity, rather. And so I go ahead and describe a couple of specific pieces of evidence that might support the counterclaim that the transportation revolution helped to forge deeper economic ties between the North and the South. And that's what I do in this sentence here. They might point to the growing transportation links between the cotton producers of the Deep South and the rapidly developing textile industry in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, and beyond as evidence to support this claim. All right, so I've satisfied, I've done this part of the template for my thesis. I have satisfied this portion of the rubric that we use in class. Having a historically defensible counterclaim, and following that counterclaim with one specific, substantial, relevant, and accurate example of historical evidence. That's the part that's highlighted there. Now I move on to another part. This is not something you have to do, but notice how in the template, I suggest that again, this will depend on what you're arguing and what kind of documents you have in front of you and that they provide to you. Sometimes you might find yourself in a position where you are using documents in the thesis, and that's okay. I actually ended up using 3 documents. Now, I know I've said to my folks, maybe 1, tops 2, but it's not a hard and fast rule. It does make the thesis a little bit longer, the more documents you throw in there. A little bit harder to find your own argument in there for the reader. But as long as you're clear about what your argument is ultimately, um, if you need to include 2 or 3 documents, uh, then go ahead and do it. I found myself having to do it, and so I just went for it. Um, now, what what goes into a document analysis? Um, uh, well, I don't write that. I don't put that in here, although I probably should have. But because I normally will expect document analyses in the body paragraphs. But this should, applies. This here applies similarly up here. For each document that you use, and remember you have to use 6 of the 7 documents somewhere in your essay, you need to A, describe the document, so a sentence or a clause in which you summarize what is going on in that document, and B, explain why you're talking about that document in this particular paragraph, in this particular context of your essay. How does it relate to the argument you're making in that section of the essay? If for 3 documents, you also have to provide, analyze the historical context, or the intended audience, or the point of view, or the purpose. You don't have to do this for all 6 documents, but you do have to do this for 3 documents, at least in the traditional document-based question. Okay, so let's go back to my essay. And I actually, after my counterclaim, I do use 3 documents, like I said, and I do those things for each of these 3 documents. I describe each document, and I explain how they pertain to my argument in that section of my essay. So remember, I'm saying that that some might argue that the transportation revolution helped to forge national unity, and they might argue that because there were stronger ties between North and South due to the ties between Southern cotton and Northern industry, especially textile industries, the textile industry. There are actually 3 documents in the essay that sort of demonstrate this or reflect this, and I include them here. I start with document 1. Many seem to believe that, as Robert Fulton expressed in a letter to Albert Gallatin, and notice how I, just for the sake of the reader, in parentheses, I cite document 1, the country was developing, quote, stronger bonds of union as a result of revolutionary developments in transportation that made it easier and cheaper to move goods and people across the country. So this document, I'm talking about how this document shows that there were people who were arguing that there were stronger bonds of union as a result of the transportation revolution, and it does conform with the counterclaim, which is what I'm discussing in this part of the essay. I move on to the second one. So I described it. Robert Fulton expressed it in a letter that the country was developing stronger bonds of union, and talk about how it connects to that portion of my essay. I move on to another document. And many were as optimistic about the prospects for national unity as Samuel Breck, document 4, was when he noted with exuberance how quickly one might travel from Philadelphia, a northern city, to Richmond, a southern city, thanks to growing railroad ties. So I'm describing the document, and in that description, I'm also talking about how it kind of goes along with the counterclaim, which is that there was greater national cohesion as a result of the transportation revolution because people could travel from the north to the south more quickly and more cheaply. And then finally, certainly the map in document 7 illustrates growing rail ties between the cotton states of the Deep South and the industrializing northern states. So I both in one sentence describe the document, the growing rail ties between the cotton states of the Deep South and the industrialized northern states. And I might even just to clinch it here, suggesting a greater national unity, just to for the reader to know that to understand that I know that this document is. I'm making it clear that this document conforms to is there because I'm describing it there because it goes along with this counterclaim here that I'm highlighting. So 3 documents in my thesis, all of which match up with my counterclaim. Now notice that how you are expected for 3 of the documents, 3 of the 6 documents that you use in your essay, you have to also analyze for historical context or intended audience or point of view or purpose. I did not do that for any of these 3. I will do it later for the 3 that I use in my body paragraphs, and I'll point that out. Now, moving on to the meat of my thesis. So far I've talked about contextualization, kind of putting it in broader scope. I've also provided a counterclaim, explored it, explained why some people might say that there was greater unity as a result of the transportation revolution. But now I'm going to say I'm going to provide a blueprint of my argument for this essay, which is the part that begins typically with however, and I make my argument. In doing so, making my argument, I also provide 2 historically defensible claims. Meaning, I don't just say, hey, I think there was more national, or rather, I think that the country became more divided as a result of the transportation revolution, not less so. That's not enough. That's my broad argument, as you can see here. In spite of the growing cohesiveness of the southern and northern economies, the transportation revolution actually undermined national unity. That's not enough. They will not give you credit for a thesis that ends there, because you're not really answering the question. You're not providing categories of analysis that answer the question. You're just saying a yes or no answer, basically. Yes, there was national unity. No, there wasn't. But they want you to go beyond that, to explore reasons why you think there were or were not. There was or was not greater national unity as a result of the transportation revolution. And that's why I say there are 2 reasons why there was a dissolution of cohesiveness. Firstly, the transportation revolution led to the expansion of slavery in the South, which was accompanied by a growing abolitionist movement, primarily in the North, leading to increased sectional tensions. That's my claim. That's my first claim. And I will devote my first body paragraph after the thesis to that first claim. Now notice how we've been talking about all year, remember? We've been talking all year about how your claims should not be too vague nor too specific. Too vague would be something like, firstly, the transportation revolution led to economic disunity. Well, what does that mean? What aspect of the economy? Or even if you say something like political divisions. Well, what kind of political divisions? They want a more substantive answer than just a really vague generality. And I have to say that because it's often students are tempted to just leave it at that. I see this a lot. Students might write something like, well, there was greater national or more disunity thanks to the transportation revolution in the realm of economics and politics. That might be okay in other settings, but it just so happens for the AP exam, that's not okay. They want you to say exactly what you mean by economic developments that reflected disunity, for example. But they also don't want you to get into the weeds. You can't say something like, well, the transportation revolution led to disunity because of Frederick Douglass's activism. Well, what? that's a narrow, very, very narrow phenomenon, which is certainly part of a larger development. And you might use that later on in your essay as evidence for a larger phenomenon. But here you're talking about the bigger picture. So that's what I do here. So that's what this language means. Not too vague, not too specific. Goldilocks rule, just right. Secondly, the transportation revolution caused a growing political divide between those advocating for a stronger role for the federal government in economic development and those who viewed such a development as inimical to the country's political ideals. Instead of just saying that the transportation revolution caused political divisions, which probably wouldn't get me any credit on the AP exam, I describe the nature of those political divisions. On the other hand, I don't go as far as saying, well, the transportation revolution caused a rift between the Whig Party, and the Democratic Party. Well, sure, but certainly there's something. They're part of a larger phenomenon, a larger political phenomenon, a larger set of political developments. They want you to keep your eye on the big picture. Again, without being too big, too vague. So this is tough. The Goldilocks rule applies here to these claims. So I've gotten my points for my thesis. I have written my contextualization, a counterclaim. I included a couple documents in the thesis because this is a document-based question. And now I have accomplished the task of stating what my own argument is and what two categories or claims I'm going to explore in body paragraphs. Notice how in my two body paragraphs, which is what I suggest you write, two body paragraphs, I focus on one claim a piece. Let's have a look. Here, as you can see, I simply repeat the same claim that I made up top in the thesis because, you know what, who cares? I don't have time to reword it to make it sound nicer or different. This is the paragraph where I'm going to talk about the fact that the transportation revolution led to increased sectional tensions thanks to the expansion of slavery and the growing abolitionist movement. Now, notice how I strongly suggest that you divide up your paragraph thusly. Start with your claim again, then your evidence. Now remember, this is a document-based question, so evidence gets a little trickier. Evidence here has to be something from history that is not explicitly referenced in the documents. Now everybody hates that, I know, and it's not, don't kill the messenger. But I can't really use anything that is explicitly mentioned here. So for example, I can't use Gibbons versus Ogden, a Supreme Court case, as my evidence in this part of my essay. Of course, I can use this document later in that paragraph to prove my point, but I get a separate point here in this rubric and on the AP rubric for evidence, as they put it, beyond the documents. In fact, I'll prove it to you. Here's their rubric, or their rudimentary rubric. Additional piece of specific historical evidence beyond that found in the documents that is relevant to the argument about the prompt. So I have to make sure that the evidence I'm using to get that point or those points is not explicitly referenced in the document. They want to know that you know history, or you know this history, unprompted by the documents. So anyway, I decided to use the anti-slavery movement, and specifically Frederick Douglass, who escaped from slavery, and William Lloyd Garrison, whose publication The Liberator posted regular condemnations of the institution and the American political system that gave it legal protection. A sentence, a long one, that does the trick. It describes accurate evidence that is relevant, of course, and is thorough, my description. I don't just say, for example, Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison fought against slavery. I say a little bit of something about Frederick Douglass. I say a little bit of something about William Lloyd Garrison. I name drop his major publication, and that's good enough to get me the point here. They know that I know something about this history, and none of those things is referenced in the documents. Frederick Douglass, the Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison are not in the documents, so they're fair game. Next, I suggest that you use reasoning. So you've made your claim that the transportation revolution caused disunity because of the rise of the expansion of slavery and anti-slavery. And you provided a piece of evidence, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, the Liberator are examples of the abolitionist movement. And now you have to explain why that proves your claim. In other words, you have to connect the dots between the cause and the effect. Let's see how they put it in their thing. Okay, it's not quite here, but the College Board, and this again I know from my training, with as a grader for the College Board, I've graded DBQs for a couple of several years. What they want is for you to prove that you can engage in the quote historical reasoning that is relevant to the question. Here, the historical reasoning is cause and effect. So if you're saying this caused this, or this caused that, X caused Y, then you have to draw the connection between X and Y. For those of you in my classes, remember the underpants gnomes. And I'll leave it at that because that would take too long to explain, but hopefully you remember what I mean by that. You can't just assume the reader understands the connection between X and Y. You have to draw it for them. And that's what I do in this part of my essay, or my body paragraph here. So this is my claim, this is my evidence that I've used, and this is the part where I explain why that piece of evidence proves my point. So I'm trying to say that the transportation revolution caused disunity because it caused slavery to grow in the South and anti-slavery to grow in the North. And here's how I do that. This movement can be viewed, meaning the anti-slavery movement, can be viewed as a direct result of the transportation revolution. As Native Americans were removed from prime cotton land in the Deep South, Eli Whitney's cotton gin made cotton production cheaper and more efficient, and canal, road, and later railroad infrastructure made it possible to move cotton from the South to the textile factories of the North. The institution of slavery saw explosive growth in the South. Unsurprisingly, this fueled the anti-slavery movement and engendered growing divisions between North and South. So I have achieved the task of one, writing a body paragraph that presents a historically defensible claim supporting the argument. Two, that claim is supported by at least one specific, substantial, relevant, and accurate example of historical evidence that is not explicitly referenced in the documents and that I describe adequately. And three, for this paragraph, I have supported my claim with reasoning that fully and effectively explains why the historical evidence supports the claim by using the relevant by employing the historical thinking skill relevant to a cause and effect prompt, by thoroughly linking the cause being described to its effect. I do that one time for one paragraph. Now I move on, if applicable, to this part of my template, right? And that is the document analysis. Aside from providing an argument with evidence that I bring to the table, they also want me to use their evidence as well. And that's the documents. And I do that in this paragraph. Remember, you have to do two things for every document. I have to A, describe the document, and B, explain how it pertains to my claim in that paragraph. Let's see where I left off. Okay, so I go ahead and start with document 5 here. And I say, well, so document 5, remember, is this document here, an engraving by James S. Buckingham, an English traveler, in a book called The Slave States of America. I say, the engraving, slaves shipping cotton by torchlight, and I provide the citation, reflects the impact of the transportation revolution on the Southern economy and the enslaved African Americans who were its victims. So um, that's where I explain why I'm using this document in this paragraph, because it goes along with my point that the transportation revolution caused disunity due to the growth of slavery. It reflects the impact of the transportation revolution on the Southern economy and the enslaved African Americans who were its victims, as it depicts enslaved people loading cargo on board a modern-looking steam vessel at nighttime. That part there is where I describe the engraving. So I've done the job of A, describing the document, and B, explaining how it relates to the claim in this paragraph. I'm going to do one more thing, though, because remember, for 3 documents, I also have to describe either the historical context, the intended audience, the point of view, or the purpose of the document. And here's what I do. One might argue that Buckingham meant to provide a dispassionate depiction of economic life in the U.S. South for curious readers. Had he meant to condemn slavery, as perhaps an abolitionist might have done, he could have chosen to zoom in on the characters in the scene and thus humanize them and their suffering, rather than to merely provide a panoramic view. So here I'm talking about purpose. But notice how I say more than just the purpose of this document is to show slaves loading a ship. That's what a lot of students would be tempted to do with a document like this, but it doesn't quite do it it won't do it for the readers from the College Board who are reading your essay. They want you to say something about how that purpose might affect, inform the document itself. Another tack would be to talk about what the author of the document might want the reader or the viewer to do after having viewed the document. So in other words, most people will say something like, the purpose of the document is to say that slavery is bad or slavery is good, or to depict slavery. Something simple and superficial like that. My point here is that you have to really talk substantively about how the purpose informs the document. And here's how I do that. I say, look, it looks like, he's just providing a dispassionate depiction of economic life. It's this kind of zoomed out, panorama. If his purpose were different, in other words, if he was an abolitionist, and my impression is that Buckingham might have been, for different reasons. If it were an avowed, openly abolitionist author, he would have, and his purpose was to condemn slavery. He would have zoomed in on the faces of some of these enslaved people and to humanize them, to show the misery that they suffer as a result of the institution of slavery. That's what they want you to do when you talk about either the historical context or the audience or purpose or point of view. So I move on to my next paragraph. Remember, again, my second body paragraph should do more or less exactly what I did in my first body paragraph. My second claim, directly from my thesis, a piece of evidence that supports that claim, some reasoning that thoroughly links the cause to the effect, and, if applicable, document analysis. Remember, it'll depend. How many documents you have in each paragraph will depend on your argument, the documents themselves, etc. There's no rule that you have to put a certain number of documents in any one paragraph. Let's have a look. Here's my claim. Again, I copied and pasted this straight from my thesis. The transportation revolution caused a growing political divide between those advocating for a stronger role for the federal government and those who viewed such a development as inimical to the country's political ideals. That's this part here. And then here is my evidence. Remember, they're looking for one specific, substantial, relevant, and accurate example of historical evidence, something that is not explicitly referenced in the documents, that is also adequately described. This divide was reflected in the changing party systems of the first half of the 19th century. By the 1830s, the country's predominantly white male electorate had become fractured into those who voted for the Whig Party, which advocated for a muscular federal government, and those who preferred Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party, which advocated for a narrow interpretation of the U.S. Constitution and the powers of the federal government. Let me highlight what I'm reading here. Jealously defending the right of state governments to manage their own affairs. That's my evidence. I'm talking basically about the second party system, the Democrats and the Whigs, none of which are referenced specifically in these documents. If somebody says here, if there was like the platform of the Whig Party, then I probably wouldn't be able to use it as evidence. I definitely would be able to use the document as I would have to, but the Whig but that piece of evidence would be off limits for if I wanted to count as quote evidence beyond the documents end quote. But it's not. So that's what I talk about: the Whigs and the Democrats. Now I have to provide my reasoning. That is, I have to thoroughly link the cause to the effect. My argument is that the transportation revolution, innovations in transportation in the first half of the 19th century, led to political divisions in this country, meaning disunity politically. Now I have to prove it. All I've said so far is that I made the claim, and I provided a piece of an example of political divisions, but I have not really proven that those political divisions were caused by the transportation revolution. And that's what I do over here in these two sentences. One of the biggest sticking points between the two major parties was transportation. For many, the technological innovations of the transportation revolution persuaded them of the need to grow the power of the federal government. The Whigs called for funding by Congress of internal improvements, such as interstate roads and canals, and the implementation of Henry Clay's American system to unify the country through transportation, a national bank, and protective tariffs for industry. On the other hand, the Jacksonian Democrats believed these measures would facilitate the development of an overbearing federal government that would oppress the small farmers in southern and western states who they believed were the backbone of the nation. So I've connected the two, the transportation revolution to political disunity in a couple of sentences. So I accomplish the second, I get the second point here for reasoning, and I get the second point for evidence beyond the documents as well. Now I wrap up my analysis of documents by presenting two more documents, which brings it up to 6 total in the entire essay. And remember, again, that I have to, for each document, describe it and explain how it relates to the claim in this paragraph. My claim is that the transportation revolution caused disunity politically. 2 documents actually reflect that, and I use those 2 documents here. Thomas Jefferson expresses the Democrats' misgivings around federal funding of transportation projects in his letter to William Branch Giles, document 3. As he sees it, so notice how I'm connecting the document to my discussion of Democrats' misgivings around federal funding of transportation projects. In other words, I'm telling the reader that I'm talking about Thomas Jefferson's letter in this paragraph because this paragraph is about the political divisions between Democrats and Whigs, and this letter reflects those divisions between 2 factions in this country. He wrote it before the Whigs technically existed, but the divisions were still the same. As he sees it, those who would several years later call themselves Whigs were expanding the powers of Congress beyond their constitutional limits by calling for the, quote, construction of roads and the digging of canals by the federal government. This is where I describe the contents of the essay, of the document. So I describe the document, and I explain how it relates to my claim. But I go one step farther, because remember, for 3 documents, I have to also talk about historical context. When was this document written and what was going on at the time? The intended audience, the point of view, or the purpose of the document. I choose to write about the intended, rather the point of view here. I'm going to talk about who Jefferson was and why. And remember, that's not enough. Again, a lot of kids will stop at that. They'll say, "Oh, the point of view of this document is Thomas Jefferson, who was, the third president of the United States." You might even say, Thomas Jefferson, who was kind of the father of the Democrats. But that doesn't really do what they want you to do. They want you to explain how the point of view impacts the document itself. So what? Because it was written by Thomas Jefferson, obviously, certain language is used, and certain language isn't used. It's rejected. Certain ideas are explored in certain ways, and that's what they want you to be able to do. So, I write Jefferson, who might be viewed as the father of the Democratic Party. This is and a firm believer in the right of states to defend themselves from an overly powerful federal government. This is me describing the point of view. And here is me describing how the point of view impacts the document itself. Jefferson, because he was the father of the Democrats and because he was such a firm believer in the right of states to defend themselves from the federal government, he uses such phrases as the usurpation of their rights to describe the effects of these policies on the states. And he denounces as a little sophistry the efforts to stretch the language of the Constitution. Now I've done the job of describing how the point of view shapes the language, the imagery, the content of the document. And I do the same thing for the last document I talk about, document 2, which is John Quincy Adams. It's a really nice foil to Jefferson's document. On the other hand, John Quincy Adams, in his inaugural address, document 2, expresses the opposite view, comparing federal funding of transportation projects to the great infrastructure projects of the Roman Empire, still admired today. Unlike Jefferson, Adams, whose views inspired the formation of the Whig Party several years later, so I'm telling you who Adams is, that's his point of view. He believed in strong federal power. Therefore, he asserts that, quote, all constitutional objections to federal funding for transportation projects, that's me kind of adding to his language, will ultimately be removed. He's confident that, the Constitution can handle this, can stretch that far because of who he is, because of his point of view. So, I've done the job of describing the document, explaining how it connects to my claim, and describing the one aspect of the document, the point of view of the document, and how it connects. And that's it. I've done everything they want me to do. I don't need a conclusion. Probably won't have time for a conclusion, or any sort of fancy, kind of ending. I did all the things they wanted me to do, and I'm satisfied that I've gotten all the points. And I hope you are too. Thank you guys for listening, and hope to, quote, see you